Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Liz Stewie and I work for Violence Free Colorado. And for those of you who don't know, we are the statewide domestic violence coalition here in Colorado. And so we are really excited today to have Leah here to share with us a lot of really wonderful information that I think is going to be really helpful for everybody as we're navigating our new reality of supporting survivors and victims in our current climate. So thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, please take the poll that popped up when you logged in. That just gives us some good information for our grant reports. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Maria from CICASA, who are our co-hosts in this project.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon for some of you. We're so excited, like Liz said, to have you all on this webinar and for Leah to present. This is information that you all have been asking us for, so we wanted to make sure we delivered on that. I'm going to be on keeping an eye on the group chat, answering any questions that I can, and also just making sure that we get to your question as time allows. So thanks, Liz. Thanks for co-hosting with us.
Hey everybody, this is Leah from the Resource
Over
Sharing
to you.
Project. Yeah. So this is Leah from the Resource Sharing Project. I am so excited to join today. I am the Rural Training and Technical Assistance Specialist at the Resource Sharing Project. And I have spoken to so many rural programs during this pandemic, and I am just really grateful to be able to join with all of you today to just share more about what I've heard and learned from the rural programs I've spoken with, and in speaking with so many of my colleagues as we sort of plan what this new normal looks like for the time being. And I'm also just excited to join with all of you to have some conversations about what these changes have looked like for your programs as well. So I want this to be interactive. I want you to join the conversation. Don't hesitate to join the chat box and share what your reality has been like, what questions that you have, what is working for you that you want to share with other folks on the webinar. We're just kind of all in this together, trying to figure out what this looks like. So I think we're just trying to surface wisdom from wherever we can find it. And there's so much wisdom on this call, I'm certain of it. So thank you so much to the Colorado Coalitions for hosting this and also for opening it up nationally for anyone else to join. That's so kind of both of you. And so I'm excited to get started. Like I said, don't hesitate to add your 2 cents, your advice, or your questions just sort of throughout the webinar. We're not saving all the questions for the end. We can address the questions as they come. So don't hesitate to ask them. So the objectives of this webinar are to talk about what the isolation that advocates are experiencing right now, what that feels like to be providing advocacy remotely and sort of how to navigate that, to talk about what are some of the ways that we can provide support and information and supervision to the advocates that are working remotely, and then just to provide a space for all of us to just talk about sort of what it's been like and how we're getting through and what's working and what's not working, because sometimes what's not working is just as helpful and powerful for people to hear as what is. So I will just say sort of the disclaimer to this slide is that really to get you this conversation as quickly as possible, we are using an old sort of previously approved webinar slides today so that we didn't have to have this sort of reapproved by the powers that be. So these slides that you're gonna see today, they were not created specifically with COVID-19 in mind, but instead are a previous webinar that we had hosted years ago in our rural training and TA project. And so we've adapted the slides as much as possible to sort of suit what we're going to talk about today. But the slides might not have every piece of information that I'm going to talk about or that you would like on them, but we're going to talk about, you know, everything that that we were going to talk about already through the lens of COVID-19. So take lots of notes, and also the coalitions are going to be sending out all the resources that like I reference in the chat box, and they're also going to send them out in an email to you after this webinar. So you don't have to be like scribbling constant notes the whole time, but also you'll have access to those resources. So we're absolutely going to actually get to all of these objectives, but more specifically through that lens of COVID-19. And I think one of the positive outcomes from all of this is that as we're figuring out these exciting new ways to meet the needs of survivors, that this is not completely new work to us, that lots of programs and communities have been accessing and providing remote advocacy services, particularly as we're talking about rural communities, that like we are not new to remote services. And so what's fantastic is that while some of us for the first time are sort of being forced to figure this out much more quickly than we ever would have liked, that this is not something that's completely new. And hopefully when this all ends, we are not going to just sort of go back to business as usual, that we will have all figured out another and a new way to serve survivors and meet their needs in the ways that they need their needs met. So I think it's actually really hopeful and exciting. And once again, as we've sort of framed this conversation specifically around rural communities, like rural advocates and rural programs, like one of the reasons I just love to get to do rural training at TA is that y'all kick butt. Like you're so good at your jobs, and you've always, pandemic or no pandemic, had to be incredibly creative and hardworking and innovative to serve the survivors in your rural communities with really few resources and funding. And so you all were already built to doing this, right? Made to quickly pivot and find new ways to get folks the resources that they need. And really, I think the rest of the field is going to be looking to us, looking to rural advocates and rural communities for how we're doing this work to meet their needs, because this is the way we've been doing things. And you are already so amazing and ready for this work. So I think it's so exciting to join all of us together to talk about what this looks like. So why is remote advocacy so important? So the majority of folks that I've spoken with so far moved their entire staff to working from home. Not everyone, not every program I've spoken with, but I would say probably 85–90% of the programs I've spoken with are now having their staff work primarily from home. So it really depends on the state or the community, or frankly, the day or the week that I'm talking to folks. Some folks have stay in place orders, others don't, others will have them in the future. It's sort of always changing, but it seems as though that what I'm hearing is that the majority of folks are working from home, and this has not been our normal. Even if we've been providing remote advocacy in our community, often what that means in rural communities is working from an outreach space away from the main office, a donated community space, working out of our cars. Remote advocacy hasn't looked like working from home. It has looked other ways, but we are familiar with and know how to work away from the main office, is what a lot of programs are telling me. So I've been hosting what I've been calling office hours twice a week, just for rural programs to come, to share, to be together with what they're struggling with, what's working, just to decrease isolation, because for so many of us, we're not used to working alone or working in silos and being separated from our coworkers so extremely. So just to kind of be together and brainstorm. And this woman named Mary shared on one of our more recent office hours this really fantastic analogy that has just kind of stuck with me. And she said that when computers first came out, that everybody, including her, was just sort of treating a computer like it was a typewriter. And folks would get a computer, but then they just sort of naturally wanted to use the computer the same way they'd used a typewriter, which of course is, 5% of the function of what we now know a computer can really sort of do. And they were missing out on all these things and ways that the computer could benefit them. And so in her program, they're sort of using that analogy to working from home and working remotely. And they're trying to sort of pause, take a breath, take some time to feel their way through what does remote advocacy or working from home actually look like in our community, look like for our program, how's that working for ourselves? Not rushing to replicate the exact services or the exact way that we worked in the office at home, but instead just trying to naturally see how work changes, how it morphs, how you naturally want to work from home, or how folks are accessing services in different ways, instead of sort of shunting them through the way we want them to access services, naturally pausing and spending the last few weeks trying to figure out how are people naturally gravitating towards us, how are folks accessing our services or communicating with us, how are we working best at home, how am I interacting with my coworkers, basically. So I really want to just sort of encourage you to have Mary's attitude, as I have adopted myself, to sort of figure out slowly and surely for yourself and for your program sort of what's working best. How is this going to work differently? And how is our work and our daily work life going to look different from home or from a remote location? And really, I think the most common conversation that has come up on our office hours has been how hard it is to work from home. I think back to when I was an advocate, and so much of what I remember from that time and really what I enjoyed about my work was that it looked so different every day. I loved that when I went to work, I didn't know what I was going to be doing that day, who I was going to talk to, where I was going to be in my community. I went where the work needed to be. I did what needed to be done when I got to work that day. And then suddenly transitioning to working from home or working at the coalition, suddenly now I'm in one spot all day. I sit on my butt and I'm in front of a computer, and that felt really exhausting and different and just really hard to adapt to. And that's what I'm hearing from so many advocates, that we're used to sort of running around and talking to people and just sort of not having that consistency of doing, even just like having the consistency of doing our work in the office from the same chair, in the same desk, that sort of puts you in that mind of like, I'm at work, I'm in work mode, I'm work Leah. And, now doing that from home, where our environment and our surroundings say, do fun things and relax and be with our family, is really a dichotomy that I think so many people are struggling with. And so I want to encourage you to be creative and be curious about how you're working best, to just pay attention every day, check in with yourself a couple times a day, like what's sort of working for me, what's not working for me. Be curious, try new things. These are so many of the skills we use with survivors that are built in our blood, that we are so good at, is what makes us good advocates. And now I think we have to sort of take some of that stuff and apply it back to our own lives. And I feel like we're often telling survivors, like, be curious about your own survivorship, be curious about how you're responding to this trauma or this new time. So we have to internalize that same curiosity for ourselves. I'm so glad Catherine says that this resonates with me strongly. I needed to hear that. I'm so glad. I think that we also just can't expect to be 100% productive day 2 of working from home. I think we really have to give ourselves some grace and some kindness, that we and our coworkers and the people we supervise, that we're all figuring this out together, and it's not going to work right away. And give yourself some time to figure out what's going to work. And I think absolutely it's something different is going to work for each person. Just like there's no one size fits all advocacy, I think there's no one size fits all working from home. I've worked from home for about a year, and my coworkers all work from home as well. And, you know, the transition for me was bumpy, and I had to be curious and reflect for myself. And I think what works for me in my workday is different than what works for my coworkers also. And I think it's powerful to name that and hear that, and to know that the way I do my work or the way my day looks different than my coworkers, and like that's okay. So I will give some practical advice though, because I think that's so much of what people are asking for and sort of what's been surfacing in all these conversations I've been having with folks. So some of the things that I'm hearing the most is that it's really helpful to create a workspace for yourself, that whatever that looks like for you, even if it can't be permanent, because so many of us are living in situations where like we don't have the room or the space to actually have like a dedicated office or a setup like that. So find a way to create a workspace, even if it's not permanent for you. So for some people, it is like literally a box or a drawer that is your work laptop, your work computer, your files, the things that sort of are work things for you, the books you're reading, whatever that looks like, in a box in a drawer. Pull it out in the morning, set it all up at your kitchen table or wherever you find the spot, pack it away at the end of the day, and sort of create that space that is work, even if it's sort of temporarily. So a box or a drawer. Some folks have been saying that like working out of their car is sort of their normal already. So even though they could work from home, they're going out and working from their car, or they're taking calls in their car because that's sort of a private space, or just frankly somewhere I think a lot of rural advocates are used to working from because of the sort of geographic realities of working in a rural community. Other advocates have told me that they have set up different spaces in their home that maybe normally wouldn't be that way. So they'll work from their dining room table, but they make sure that they relax in their living room and they sort of don't cross-pollinate the spaces, that they no longer relax at their dining room table and they're not doing any work from their living room. They've sort of created zones in their home. So I think what I'm hearing from so many people is that we've got to get creative and try so many different things and try something a little bit different each day, and just listen to your intuition and check in with yourself about kind of what's working. Another thing I'm hearing is creating a commute time for some people has been really helpful. Once again, especially in rural communities, we often have long commute times to get to the office because of our geographic isolation. And so I've heard for years now that when I talk to people about like vicarious trauma or, you know, how do you take care of yourself, that a number one answer I hear from rural advocates is the commute time is I get in my truck and I listen to my music and I've got a 30-minute ride back home, and that's how I decompress after work. And it's that transition between work and play, or work and relaxation. And so now that, you know, folks are working from home, that's gone. And so for some folks, they're creating a commute time, adding an extra commute time into their workday that really theoretically to get from bed to table should be about 20 seconds, build in a fake commute time. So walk around the block at the beginning of your day before you sit down to work, or at the end of your day before you start to relax. Or for some folks, it means getting dressed in the outfits and clothes you'd wear to work, or doing your hair, or doing your makeup, or sort of build in some sort of ritual, whatever that looks like for you, that sort of signals this is the beginning of my workday, or this is the beginning, or this is the end of my workday, and this is sort of my commute time, this is my transition, I think is really helpful. And then before we kind of get to some things going on in the chat box that I'm excited to address, the last sort of thought I had was just that it's not even advice as much as it's a plea from me to you to take advantage of what is fun and good about working from home. So figure out what that is for you and embrace that, because there's so much chaos and uncertainty and stress right now that I don't want it to be all stressful to work from home or all a pressure to work from home. Like, take some joy in what it is to work from home. So for me, that is like, I'm never gonna wear real pants, and I will be professional from the top up if that's what it needs to be. But, I'm not wearing real pants, and no one can make me do that. Or, take 5 minutes and put in a load of laundry if it's nagging at you. Take 20 minutes and do all the dishes in the sink if they're staring back at you and you can't seem to grapple with the idea of doing work right now until they're done. Do them. Take 20 minutes, do that. Make the workday what you need it to be to feel productive, for it to feel good. Take a walk around the block. I think we have natural breaks in our workday normally where we get to eat lunch, or we get to pause, we get to chat with our coworker for 10 minutes in between appointments. We have those natural breaks anyway. We are not beings that are productive 8 hours a day straight with no breaks. So build in those little things too that break up your workday and make you feel good. And thankfully, I feel like I've definitely talked to some advocates that have embraced this and are saying to me like, look, my office was the same room as the copier, and I'm getting more work done at home than I ever have. And it feels good to not talk to people. And I am loving isolation. And talking to those people brings me a lot of joy. I want you to take joy in some tiny aspect of remote advocacy that's kind of working for you. So I'm seeing in the chat box, I read a post on Facebook that I thought was relevant. We're not working from home. We're at home during a crisis trying to work. Ooh, I like that. I think that really puts it in perspective. And someone else said, it is important because during the pandemic and isolation, clients can spiral quickly, and advocacy in front of that is critical. I think it's really easy for us to spiral too. So I think we have to remember that we have to take care of ourselves during all of this and figure out what's working for us, or we're just not going to be able to meet those needs. Someone else said, I don't have an ideal place to set up a work area, and I'm suffering from lots of headaches and pains with no good desk and chair. Stretch breaks seem necessary, but man, I always forget. I think set a timer for yourself for breaks and really hold yourself to that. Oh, someone actually just wrote, I'm setting an alarm on my phone to remind me to get up from the sofa. Love it. I think that's really helpful and important. I think it's helpful for me. And, I would see if it's at all possible to borrow your desk or your chair from your office. I don't know if you have a stay in place order in your state or not, but if your work is able to give you anything that could work, I think that would be really helpful. Or maybe even just a neighbor that has some extra, like a good office chair can be really helpful. But explore what your community is able to help you grab. I think it's going to be good. Any other questions or thoughts or tips you got? Put them in the chat box around sort of like, what is it like to work remotely, and sort of like, why are we feeling good about it? Why is it helpful right now? Oh yeah, I'm so glad someone mentioned Pomodoro. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Someone mentioned that also on our last office hours. That is a really good sort of efficient way to work that also gives you lots of breaks. And I think that's definitely been working for lots of advocates. I'm loving the chat box. You guys are doing great. Okay, so some types of remote work. As you can imagine, this slide used to have types of remote work that just no longer sort of made sense in COVID-19. So they're all gone, which is why the slide doesn't have much text on it. So these are kind of some categories of work that I've been getting a lot of questions about. So the first I want to start with is I want to start with some remote services that we are already providing and we are already super kick butt at providing. and that is a 24-hour helpline. 24-hour helpline services that, are created for folks who are lonely and isolated and scared and stressed. We already know how to do that work. So we want to continue to lean hard on this service as one of the best ways that we can support our community. I think there's also this impulse to figure out what is all the new tech we can use that's going to help us meet the needs of folks at home. But, in a lot of rural communities, we can't, that tech is not always helpful if we don't have folks in our community that have good high-speed internet, that have access to computers or smartphones. It's going to be hard to access some of that tech. We will talk about some of that tech by the end of the call, but I think it's also just important to remember that our phone service is the backbone of advocacy services. I think lots of programs and frankly lots of communities see our helpline, or as they often call it, a crisis line or a helpline, as a way to access shelter and maybe as a first way to contact a program, and then you sort of set up in-person services. But our helplines can do so much more than that. And now is honestly just the perfect time to practice those skills of advocacy and emotional support and listening over the phone, of not limiting our call times or not limiting the sort of frequency that folks are allowed to call, and to practice building rapport and trust with folks that we can't see. Now is the time to really build those skills and to lean on those skills that we already have. Most rural community members can have access to a phone that is the most basic version of a phone that will make a phone call. I know, what's it called? Oh, the word is blanking that I'm blanking on, but service might be difficult or spotty, but it is the most low tech we can use to connect with people in our community. And so I really want to just start by saying that I think our 24-hour helplines are really where we want to put our focus. Like I said, for folks that are lonely and scared and stressed and isolated, we can be a support system for folks just to chat and not feel lonely. That's providing a service that no one has to call us in crisis right now, for us to be able to just give them some support and some love and some social connection, I think. And I think that, we're going to have new folks that have never accessed our services before, that are going to be calling and sort of feeling nervous and unsure about what it means to access our services or how to access our services when all this is going on. And so I just want us to bring our warmest, most welcoming self to those calls and to sort of walk them through this new way of accessing services, which will be, primarily over the phone. So being able to do some intakes and set up some appointments with folks that are calling for the first time. And just, remember that this whole thing, no matter when you call a helpline in a pandemic or not, that it's really nerve-wracking and it's weird and it's uncomfortable and people are unsure of where they're calling and why. And so I think it's always really helpful to orient folks to the call, to say, hi, I'm Leah and I'm so glad you called. If you're not sure why you called or what you want to talk about, that's totally chill. And we can talk or we can sit in silence. All options are open. I'm comfortable doing whatever you need, just to orient people to what that call looks like. Because I think for so many people, they have a really sort of movie sense of what it looks like to call a helpline. And I think we can help them see the ways that they can access that service and, talk about here's some of the things that people have called me to talk about before. Do any of those things resonate? Do you know what you'd like to talk about today? And it doesn't have to be the violence. We can just chat a little bit and that's totally fine if you're just looking for some social connection. I think that's really helpful. And we have several resources on our website. If you go to resourcesharingproject.org and you click on our rural resources, we have a rural toolkit that has all of the resources we've created over the years to address rural communities and sexual assault advocacy. And then we've also collected all the resources that we love, that we often refer people to, that I find myself just frequently telling people like, oh my gosh, you'd love this resource. We just decided to collect them all in one place. Maria has wonderfully put a link to that in the chat box. So that's our rural toolkit. There's 18 different categories you can choose from. And one of those categories is helpline services. And we have a bunch of resources there about sort of what it looks like to host a helpline. Maria just put the link there in the chat box. She's killing it, of what helplines in rural communities look like, and some, considerations and thoughts about how to sort of warmly orient folks to that kind of service. So I'm just peeking at the chat box. Great thoughts on how to set up your home office. So someone wrote, we have a client recently expressed concern about not having human contact. In this case, we were lucky that the client had access to using video on the computer. I wonder about individuals who may fear the lack of, quote, human contact and do not have access to a computer and webcam capabilities. Anyone have experience with a situation like that? How did you deal with it? To be clear, the client was concerned about falling into a depression or increased anxiety without human contact, which I think, frankly, is just so real. Humans were sort of meant to be in community with each other. And so I think that's a really real concern about falling into a depression or having increased anxiety without having some just even really basic human contact of like saying hi to your neighbors or something. So I would love for folks to add in the chat box some solutions to sort of what that human contact actually looks like if you don't have access to a computer with webcam capabilities. But I will say just sort of what we've already talked about, helpline services. And I think one of the things that we have to do when we are doing ongoing advocacy with people, so not folks that are maybe just calling up for the first time or calling our helplines because they want to chat right then, but the people that we have ongoing regular appointments with, that when we talk to those folks now, when we're having those appointments, that we make sure they know that you don't just have to wait for like our weekly call for you to have contact. You can call our helpline 24 hours a day, any day of the week. I might not be or probably won't be the person that answers the phone, but anyone that answers that phone is going to be happy to chat with you, to talk. That whether we're talking about just like whatever TV show we're watching right now or whatever, it doesn't have to be about the violence or your experiences or what you're healing with. That providing that lack of isolation by giving that human contact, we are meeting a need and providing things that are healing to sexual assault survivors. Carrie said, do you have access to therapy services that do telecounseling? So that's totally an option. I will say, I think the vast majority of rural programs that I've spoken with are really struggling with mental health services, once again, even before a pandemic occurred. And so I think it's less likely that rural communities are going to have robust enough mental health services that they've figured out telecounseling. If you have that, access that. But we can be the human contact that people need, and we don't need to have therapy degrees to support people, to provide peer counseling, to just chat and talk with folks about sort of what they're struggling with or what needs they have or how we can support them best. And once again, I think for so many people right now, the biggest need is that human contact. So we can be that contact. The second sort of type of remote work I've gotten the most amount of questions about is about sort of medical advocacy and what that's sort of looking like for folks. So, most of the, I would say most of the advocates I've spoken with have hospitals that have moved away from allowing advocates even inside the hospital to provide that sort of peer support to help survivors through sexual assault exams. And so instead, programs are having, you know, the nurse call the advocate and assist and provide that emotional support and advocacy over the phone during the exam. Some have set up like telemedicine in their hospital. So, you know, like more like a video chat screen that you would use for like telemedicine, but you can have the advocate join on video to do some advocacy or some emotional support. And then others that don't have the ability to do those things or just haven't figured out the tech for any of those, or the hospital has sort of been in such crisis, they've struggled to put energy or effort into some solutions around this, have simply just dropped off some packets at the hospital to give to survivors that are like really robust packets, more than the packet we often just put out, but maybe like a packet that, in addition to all the other wonderful things we usually give to survivors when they come into the hospital, also have like a letter that says sort of, here's why we can't be with you right now, and here is all the ways that you could be in community or in relationship with us from this point forward. Here's how to get in contact with us. Here's all the ways that we can support you into the future. And, you know, unfortunately, every hospital and every community, and once again, every day of the week, it has looked a little bit different. And so it's really hard to give like specific advice. But my sort of thesis statement for medical advocacy and my pep talk to you is that, you know, the heart of advocacy and the most important service that we provide to folks who've experienced violence is listening, is emotional support, talking through options, being there for somebody. All of those things do not require a physical presence. We can do all of those things over the phone, in a letter, on video. Those are all things we can provide people other ways. And so I'm glad Maria has also included the link to the webinar that the coalition just hosted on telecounseling. Do other folks have more specific questions or thoughts or guidance on sort of what medical advocacy has looked like for the program? So the third sort of type of remote work I wanted to talk about is sort of ongoing advocacy. So, oh, real quick, someone said, what is being put in the packets? So I've heard folks putting, you know, obviously the traditional things they put in their packets. So brochures about the program, information about long-term and short-term sort of consequences or effects of sexual violence, ways to access services, particularly if that has changed. So if normally your packet might give information about like, you can call the helpline or you could walk into our office, and that is no longer a way people can access services. Really just way more specific information about what that looks like now today about how to access the services. Other people have included, as I've brainstormed with folks, you know, information on grounding techniques, breathing exercises, yoga poses, anything I think also for folks just to be able to access in their homes, particularly if they are by themselves or experiencing a lot of isolation. What are some coping mechanisms that you can use from home that are going to help you get through this time period? It could all be included in the packets. Get as creative as you want to get with things in that packet, particularly because I hear from a lot of advocates that they don't hear from the folks that are in the hospital again, or, you know, maybe 50% of folks that they support in the hospital never access services again. So a question I often say to ask yourself is, what would I want what would I want survivors to have in their hands and take with them home if I think I'm never going to be able to access that person again? What do I want them to know or to have in place if I think they're never going to access services? And include some of those things. Lindsay put in the chat box some a grounding toolkit from the Arizona Coalition. Yeah, great, that's cool. And a grounding worksheet, so maybe consider putting those in. Keep up the questions. There's just so much I want to talk about. I'm just going to keep going, but I will continue to address questions as they come. So the third kind of advocacy I'm talking about is ongoing advocacy. So thinking about all the people that you already have relationships with, the folks you've already been providing advocacy to before all of this occurred. So I want you to consider checking in with those folks that you already have a relationship with. If there has been communication between the two of you that says that they consent to you reaching out to them, that it's okay to contact them sort of proactively. Don't, if you have a relationship with those survivors, there's no need to wait for them to call you and be in crisis. You can call them and just check in and say, how's it going? How are you doing? What do you need? How are you coping? What ways can I help? Just so you know, we're still here. These are the kinds of things that we can, communicate. And once again, to connect them to the helpline and to normalize that you can use that helpline whenever you want. You don't need to be having like an active panic attack for you to call the crisis line, that you can call anytime to just talk through things. You can set up appointments, once again, over the phone with the folks that you've had ongoing contact with, or use some of the newer technology that we're going to get to in maybe the next slide. Also, you can set up support groups, transition your support groups to online support groups. Once again, using technology we're going to talk about in a slide or two. You can mail or drop off on doorsteps projects or things that the survivors you've been working with already can use to cope or to get through this time. Obviously with their consent that you will send them these items, but you could mail or you could just deliver them to their doorstep. Craft projects, craft supplies, maybe some of the projects you were planning on doing in upcoming appointments or in upcoming support groups that with directions for how to do it on their own, or say, here's all the supplies. We're going to talk Tuesday and we're going to do this craft project together over, over the phone or over our, video chat we're going to do this craft project together. You can put together folders with activities, hobbies, coping mechanisms, yoga poses, breathing techniques, and just a notebook and a pen, anything that you think is going to help folks cope and get through this time period where folks that have already experienced a lot of trauma and stress are going to experience, vastly increased amounts of trauma and stress. And then just in general, ask folks, what do you need? How can I support you? What are you struggling with? Check in with them and make sure they're doing okay. The next type of remote work I wanted to talk about is about outreach. So I want to encourage everybody to get creative with how you're reaching out to your community, to let them know that you're here, that you're still available for support. And a program I talked to last week said they were putting flyers in grocery bags, and because that's kind of the one place everybody right now is sort of allowed to go and is going and needs to go. So putting flyers in grocery bags with the information for your program. I think that program actually said they did their contact information and also other community resources sort of on one page. And put that in grocery bags, put it up in bathrooms at the grocery store, put it up at gas stations, the couple of places in our community that like everybody is sort of has to or able to access right now. Think about providing some education and also just some like silliness and fun on social media. I think that people could really use some lighthearted joy right now. So think about what that really kind of looks like on social media. Partner with some other local service organizations and figure out sort of what are they doing and how can you work together. Don't rebuild the wheel. Partner with other organizations and figure out what's working, how are people getting information, and work together on that. think about connecting with some of your religious organizations and religious communities, faith organizations. I've heard from some programs that have said that, you know, they are having greater success connecting with faith leaders now in this time of crisis than previously when they'd sort of attempted to build relationships. So now might be a good time to put some more energy into that. And as religious services have been live streamed, you know, asking or considering having the faith leaders talk about services that are available on the live stream as a way to get the information out there. And just, you know, get creative about how you're reaching out and building community. Programs have talked to me about, you know, doing Netflix party where everyone can watch the same Netflix documentary like at the same time from different locations, and then hosting like a community chat afterwards, or building community scavenger hunts, or just getting really creative with what your Sexual Assault Awareness Month activities are going to look like this month, or just how you're connecting with people. Because once again, we don't have to connect everything back to violence, that just building community in and of itself and sharing joy and creativity is helpful to survivors. And so just, you know, try to think creatively about what that looks like. And once again, try to keep in mind for the folks that are not able to access that outreach or those services online, think about what that looks like for them, which is why I think, you know, thinking about grocery bags and flyers and other things are really interesting ways to think about how to support those folks. A question in the chat box, recommendations on movies that pertain to sexual assaults, but also are blockbuster enough that people would want to tune in for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Put them in the chat box. I don't have time to sort of think right now because there's so much I want to still get to, but other folks, please put in the chat box, and I'll also do some thinking after the webinar is over and see if I can include that in the follow-up email as well. The other type of remote work that we've been talking a lot about is sort of professional development, and also this concept of sort of taking some things off the back burner. So first, professional development, you know, do all the things under that fancy grant language buzzword of professional development. So thinking about, you know, reading books, watching documentaries, reading resources, watching new and recorded webinars, you know, practicing a new prevention curriculum with your coworkers, or practicing advocacy skills that you've been wanting to try out on your coworkers or on your kids, you know, doing all the things that you always kind of wish you had time to do and that get put on our list, but that other things keep just kind of getting piled on top of the list. If Maria could put in the chat box, the researching project on our rural page, that toolkit that we already shared, that one has so many resources for you to access, but also in a different link just to the rural page of our resource sharing project website, is all the recorded webinars. We have dozens of recorded webinars you can access, do some continued education, you know, pick at some of those things that often get sort of put on the bottom of our list that we can kind of pull up to the top now that we have the time. Yes, that is perfect, Maria, thank you. You know, take some stuff off the back burner. So, you know, reorganize your files, create that binder you've always wanted to create to give to new employees to sort of orient them to work and welcome them to the organization, update that prevention curriculum you've been meaning to do, you know, research language access, update old forms, start that book club in your community you've always been wanting to start, all that kind of stuff. I think now is the time to pull that out and start to navigate what some of that looks like and how to build that in your community. Loving all the recommendations in the chat box. Okay, remote platforms. I am not going to go super in depth with this because NNEDV's Tech Safety Project has done just like truly a phenomenal job in putting these resources together. Maria, now would be the time to add all of the links that NNEDV has included from their Tech Safety Project on what remote platforms to choose. One, I'm just going to continue to say phones. I think it's fantastic to be able to use sort of old school helpline services. Even if you have survivors in your community that don't even have a phone, you know, buy a $10 candy bar phone at the gas station, give that to the survivors you're working with, something to decrease that isolation. Text, email, and social media are not in line with VAWA required confidentiality. So it is not your first line of defense. It is not your first choice when it comes to communicating with a survivor. But if that is how folks are reaching out, if that is how folks feel comfortable, if it is the only way they're able to access your services or communicate with you, please respond to them. I don't want folks to sort of send a private message on Facebook to your program and then us feel like we're not allowed to respond because it's not in line with VAWA confidentiality, and just leave that survivor hanging, unsupported, unresponded to. Respond. Please still respond to them. Let them know the limitations of the confidentiality and privacy that comes with that platform. Educate them about that. And then still, if it is the only way they feel comfortable or able to reach out to you, support them in the way they need to be supported, in the way they know how to be supported. Folks, you know, get to decide how they feel about their own confidentiality. Somebody asked, no email or text is allowed by VAWA. I can't say everything that is or is not allowed by VAWA, but what NNEDV's Tech Safety Project is saying is that it really has to do with what the phone carrier or email is that you are using, and most of that information is stored by the corporations that own, you know, Gmail or Verizon Wireless or whoever your provider is. They own that information and your text chains and your email. Like, there's a lot of confusing and complicated information, but my short answer is those are not completely confidential ways to access services. Once again, I want you to do it if that's what the survivor is wanting, is asking for, is the only way to access their services. But they also need to be able to understand what the limitations of that platform is. A lot of folks are talking about Zoom. We're on Zoom currently. Zoom is awesome video technology. Right now, we're able to do webinars with big groups of people. We could have done this using video. That's fantastic. But once again, Zoom is not compliant with all the requirements of VAWA confidentiality unless you opt into a very specific service. So you request and sign a business associate agreement, which essentially acts as a security switch so that you can turn on that end-to-end encryption. And that end-to-end encryption is what we need for something to be completely confidential. So instead, Tech Safety has recommended Scythe, Resource Connect, and Groovio as all examples of platforms that have the ability to be in compliance with VAWA confidentiality. Also, all of them are either free or have nonprofit discounts. So those are ways that you can access those services. Most of them include some version of like one-on-one video chat or a support group function. Just checking the chat box to see if I can answer any of these questions. So the thing is that most of these resources like Zoom were not created with nonprofits and like serving a human being in mind. They were created for like sales and consumerism. And so most of the time when it comes to like sales companies or consumerism, you want to know as much as possible about the people you're serving because then you're able to sell to them better, right? But that's not how we use our services, or we want to use our technology. We want to know as little as humanly possible about the people we're working with to keep that confidentiality and to keep their privacy. So for a lot of, you can't just sort of access the first sort of technology you find. But all those resources that Maria put up at the top of the chat box from Tech Safety are fantastic to help you figure this out. And if you have any questions, my email is going to be at the end of this. We can always have some one-on-one conversations about what your program's using, what you want to use, what you're interested in using. And me and the coalition together, we can help you sort of figure this out. Avi, is there a sample script of explaining limitations of confidentiality if survivors prefer to communicate via text or other non-encrypted platforms? I will think about that. I have not come across that, but I'd be happy to maybe just write up a couple sentences and we can try to include that in the follow-up email. Or if other people on the chat have examples of how they explain that limitation and you want to add it, go for it. That would be fantastic. I'm just going to keep going so that we kind of get to everything and still have time. But keep the questions coming. Everyone's fantastic. Okay, remote supervision. So, supervision is an opportunity to just provide support and information to advocates, as well as just kind of plan about, work activities, work-life balance, what's going on. There's so many different topics you can include when it comes to supervision, but right now, so much of what I think is really helpful to include in supervision is helping folks figure out what their day looks like, how to provide advocacy this way, and how to sort of balance your day and just support them in figuring out what this like weird new version of normal actually looks like. And I just want to encourage everybody to just support and trust your staff, that they're doing the best that they can. We're all just doing the best that we can. And that doesn't mean 8 hours of just like end-to-end productivity for any of us. And so we're all just trying to make it work the best way that we can. And so use some of those, problem-solving skills that we use with survivors every day to also navigate the problems that staff are running into when folks are working from home with kids, when folks are working from home with partners. We're not going to get 100% perfect confidential services necessarily if other folks are at home, right? We have to provide the best service, the best way that we know how, and to be transparent with survivors. So some of that might look like telling folks, hey, I'm so glad you called on the phone today. I'm happy to keep our appointment time, but I want you to know my kids are home with me and they're in another room and I don't think they're listening and I'm going to be quiet, but I just need you to know sort of what my reality is. And are you still comfortable and want to have this conversation right now? Like, all we can do is be honest and transparent with people about what's going on and then serve them the way they want to be served. And so remote supervision is that time to check in with people, to navigate, to brainstorm new ways of doing this, to just check in about how you're doing. I said check in with staff at least once a week. I think that is a minimum. And really, I've talked to so many folks that their supervisors are checking in like once a day to just see how are you doing. That's fantastic. Whatever you sort of have the capacity to do. But as we transition to this for the foreseeable future, there's just going to be a lot of bumps and hiccups, and we can navigate it together. Provide that really clear information about what policies and procedures have changed as a result of the pandemic. Provide really clear information on sort of what work needs to be completed or how it needs to be completed, what resources exist for continued education or professional development, how to contact other employees to decrease that isolation that folks are feeling when maybe we didn't have each other's personal contact information before because it wasn't necessary. And then, some long-term and some short-term goals to work on. Julia said we're doing daily Zoom staff check-ins in addition to the regular Zoom supervision times. That's awesome. Other folks, feel free to put in the chat box sort of like how you're checking in with your staff, how you're supporting your coworkers, because I think everybody's kind of doing it a little different, and it's really exciting and cool to hear sort of all the different ways that I think are really fun. Lindsay says, virtual Zoom lunches. Yes, I love that. Eating meals together, I feel like is so healing. I also want, during remote supervision to provide some time to just sort of check in about expectations, about how often folks can be checking in with you, or what ways to check in with you, reinforce those norms, that it's okay to call me as your supervisor. You can call me, you can text, you can email questions as you need throughout the week. What are the ways that, are best to communicate with each other? Just kind of check in with that. And then also, I just want folks to recognize the unique isolation that can be felt by folks, staff of color, or by multilingual or bicultural advocates as they are serving in their rural community. Often the communities that they are a part of, they're also supporting and in community with, and how particularly isolating and exhausting it can be to support your community and the sub-community and the smaller community that you're a part of in your rural area, and just make sure that the rest of the staff feel comfortable serving every survivor that calls, and that folks don't feel overburdened to be particularly working with certain communities in your rural area. Okay, checking the chat box here. Oh, I'm loving all these ideas. Someone asked, is anyone hearing that all the additional check-ins, meetings, socializing is getting overwhelming? So many of our monthly coalition meetings became weekly, or weekly meetings became daily to provide contact, but it seems like there are so many meetings. Yes, I am actually so with you. I've always worked from home, and I feel inundated with Zoom meetings right now. So, figure out what feels good, that frequent check-ins, frequent communication, ask folks kind of what's working. And I've also spoken to a lot of programs that are going towards methods of like what's working right now, and folks can sort of opt in or opt out. So I spoke with a program last week that paired people up and said like check in and co-work with each other if you want. So there were specific times, and you could log on to Zoom and share your video and work with your people you were paired with if you wanted, and also if you didn't want to, you didn't have to. So the folks that are like really, extroverts and really needing that connection are able to find their people and connect more together. And the folks that are like kind of loving working from home and being a little more isolated are also able to kind of sit back and not check in with as many of these meetings. So, check in with your team, figure out what's feeling good. And also, the longer it is that we do this work from home thing, the more this will feel normal, the more this will feel regular, and maybe there won't need to be quite as many check-ins. So kind of check in with your staff and figure it out. Yeah, I like this. Someone said we've explicitly started saying which meetings are required and which ones are optional, so folks can kind of figure out what's in their capacity. I love that. Okay, so then we're already kind of here, right? Team connection. So we've already talked regular supervision, staff meetings using those video platforms. And once again, lots of the video platforms that wouldn't necessarily be, VAWA compliant can still work for your staff meetings or team connections. So Zoom, Google Hangout, Skype, any of those could be great platforms to use for your team connection. I saw somebody write Slack. That's great. That's like, chatting with your coworkers. Just make sure you're not putting you know, survivor specific information into your like chats with each other, because that'll get, you know, recorded and captured, and we don't want that. But otherwise, you know, use whatever you got to stay in connection with each other. Try to celebrate together, whatever that kind of looks like for you. You know, celebrations bond people together and support that teamwork. So they don't all have to happen, you know, in person. You could try having a potluck over lunch, and you can send all the different team members meals, or, you know, like little snacks in the mail, and you could all get on and eat your snacks together at the same time, or eat lunch at the same time. Or I've talked to a lot of programs that have staff sending selfies of themselves, like, you know, each morning or once a week or something, and an email chat to each other, just kind of being like, this is what my workspace looks like today, or this is kind of what I'm doing today. Other folks have said they've done like themed dress up, like when they have their staff meeting, and that they will, you know, everybody wear your pajamas today, and like tomorrow when we have staff meeting, everybody wear, you know, I don't know what you'd wear to a luau, I don't know, just random themes. Wear a Christmas outfit, whatever feeling whimsical to you, and try to have some fun with your agency celebrations or get-togethers. The staff mentoring is kind of what I already talked about, like pair people up that have like a guaranteed person that's their person, and like if you need to chat, if you need to check in, now that's your person that you're like, yo, I need to, like, I am feeling crazy today and I really need to check in with a human being. I need to talk about something. You're my person. Do you have a couple minutes? Figure out how to designate teams of folks or check in with other people. And we've already talked about using some instant messaging like Slack or Yahoo or Marco Polo or whatever. Yeah, definitely funny hat meeting is a great idea, Vera. And I'm loving Ruby's suggestion of virtual Zoom backgrounds. Those are really fun, and I've really enjoyed people using them in Zoom meetings. So I hope more people use them. Okay, this is sort of our last topic, and then we will have time for really specific questions and chat here at the end. But I just want to talk really specifically about how vicarious trauma looks different for remote workers. This is something, like I said, we talk about even before COVID-19, that, you know, when you have staff that are working, you know, largely by themselves or away from the main office, that vicarious trauma looks a little different. So thinking about technology, you know, technology now allows folks to kind of be working anytime, anywhere, which is super cool and helpful to us, but also makes it kind of overwhelming and makes you feel sort of like you need to be working all the time, especially if you've got like coworkers or bosses that are sending you emails at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. It can make you feel like you're supposed to be working until 10 o'clock at night. Or if you check your email and you get that email, you're like, oh, should I respond? Should I do the thing they asked for in the email right now? And I think it's just really important to set some expectations in your organization around that. Some people are gonna have to work odd hours because they've got kids at home, because they're taking care of other people, and they're not able to work an 8-hour workday start to finish in one foul swoop. Like, some people are taking big chunk breaks to teach their kids, to take their kids to the park, to take care of the people in their home, to get things done. And so maybe they are going to email at 10 o'clock at night because that's when they had a free moment to work part of their 8-hour workday. But, you know, have some proactive conversations with your staff about what a workday looks like, and when, you know, when to stop working. Bring that up in supervision, because I think I've heard from so many folks that they feel the pressure now that they have their computer or they have their work at home with them to sort of be working the whole workday, and it's hard to know when to kind of pack it away and end the workday. So I think that's really important. On-call hours may be sort of increased as more people are calling and seeking services. If your program's sort of getting an influx of calls, so on-call hours might feel a little bit different or harder to do when you aren't in a traditional work setting and instead at home. And then, you know, just the isolation, it makes it harder to sort of seek support with your coworkers when you're all kind of siloed in your home separate from each other. So also feel free to share in the chat box sort of how you're combating vicarious trauma or how vicarious trauma is kind of coming up different for you now that you're working from home. But those are just some of the things that I've heard folks talk about so far. So, you know, when folks are feeling more isolated, or some of you not so isolated if you're inundated with work meetings, but, you know, trying to figure out what's a good amount of check-ins and social support and healthy ways to be in community and connection with each other. You know, build some self-care plans, talk about what people are doing to take care of themselves, and make sure that you find ways for the agency to support those plans, that folks don't just have to implement self-care plans on their own, but that there are really specific ways that your agency can help you implement those plans. Thinking about on-call work, I just want to encourage you to think about on-call work in an equitable way, not an equal way. And some folks, it's just going to be a lot harder for them to provide helpline services from home. And so it might be that there are going to be some folks at your agency that aren't able to take helpline calls, or during certain hours of the day aren't going to be able to take helpline calls. So I think a lot of us sort of create an on-call schedule, you know, many weeks or months in advance and sort of stick to it. And I think we gotta think for shorter periods of time. Maybe we just make an on-call schedule for today, or we make an on-call schedule for the next couple of days, and we check in with folks about how it's working. Some folks that maybe live alone, or it is somehow easier for them to take helpline calls, maybe those are the folks that need to have some longer helpline shifts. But then for the folks that can't take helpline calls, what can you do to support the folks that are taking the helpline calls? Can you fill out the paperwork and reports for folks? Can you, what are the ways that you can support those staff? So think about sharing the workload equitably, but not necessarily evenly or equally exactly, that we have to sort of collaborate together to figure out how to meet all these needs with our current situation. And then just workload in general, I think is something that when you're doing supervision, when you're checking with staff, you need to think about, because rural advocates are just some of the most passionate people I've ever worked with. And it's really easy for us to spread ourselves too thin and to want to be helping everyone we can at every hour of the day. And I think it's just really important for supervisors and for agencies to help folks figure out where the priorities are and when they need to just sort of shut their computer and walk away from work and realize they have to take care of themselves. So I hope, you know, in supervision that folks are able to have some of those conversations to sort of proactively bring up, how are we going to create an actual doable workday for you and not spread you too thin. And in general, to build up that resilience, we talk a lot about vicarious trauma and we forget about vicarious resilience. So in whatever ways you possibly can, bringing up all of the ways that you can in supervision to point out the ways that our community is resilient and is strong and is supporting each other and is bouncing back. Stop reading constant news articles about everything that's going wrong. Start reading some articles about the ways that people are helping each other and the ways that people are still experiencing joy and community and connection and are helping one another. Look for the ways that the survivors that you're working with are really strong and are taking care of themselves and are meeting their needs in whatever ways they can. And some of that will get back inside you too. That's the vicarious resilience part, that you'll start to feel some of that resilience within yourself also. Just checking the chat box. This is really just about 15 minutes. I'd hoped for time, but you guys asked such good questions as we went, but at least 15 minutes here at the end where we can kind of just chat with each other. I'm checking through the chat box to see what other questions we kind of got. Somebody asked, did folks implement administrative leave policies for people who can't work full time because of other care obligations so they can still get paid? Somebody said we've been more flexible with when hours are worked for those people with kids, but still saying they need to do full hours. Seems to be working so far. That's also what I've heard from a lot of programs. Somebody asked, do other folks have in-person meetings that are still happening like court? How are you managing deciding who goes or who opts out if you don't go at all, or in what circumstances? It's a really good question. Yeah, I would say someone said our courts have requested that folks appear by phone, and that's what I've been hearing most of the time, is that everywhere is just sort of moving to digital services. And honestly, I've heard positive things. Some of the agencies I've spoken to have said that the survivors have found it so much more comfortable to appear not in the same room as the person that harmed them, but instead over video chat, that it has been easier. So I think that's like a really exciting development, in my opinion. That's great. Avi said we've set up guidelines about if advocates must go in person, what to do, what to bring. That's fantastic. Somebody said we typically provide transportation to the safe house or to SANE exams. These services are still needed, but advocates are feeling uncomfortable providing these in-person services. In rural, we don't have lifts or taxis. Any ideas? Yeah, here's my only idea. If you've got some minivans, I think you could fit somebody in the back seat 6 feet away from the driver. But I don't know if that's realistic. What other questions or thoughts do folks have about what it's like to be providing remote services or supervising people remotely? We have still about 12 minutes left together. And I just want to make sure I tried to go as quick as possible so that we could kind of touch on everything, but there are some things that I sort of skimmed over so that we made sure we had time together. So now is sort of your chance to dive at all deeper into any of the questions that you hoped to sort of have answered on this webinar. I'll also put on the screen here, thank you to you, or OVC, and this is my contact information. You can email me at leah@iowacasa.org if you have any questions that didn't get answered on the webinar. If you have anything that you wanted to chat about that we talked about today, more specifically in depth in relation to your community or your program, I also put my phone number on there. That's my direct line. If you want to chat or have other questions answered. And then also check out the resourcesharingproject.org. That's our website. We have just truly so many resources, particularly everywhere on the website. I don't even think I've somehow managed to read them all after 6 years of working there. But in particular, our rural training and technical assistance page has just so many resources for you to check out during this time that I hope will be helpful for you to think about in relation to working from home or in relation to remote services, but also just as an opportunity to do professional development and some dreaming about what services can look like. For so many advocates that I've talked to on the office hours, now has been a time where their work has slowed down as outreach opportunities and education opportunities have sort of dried up, and that now all we have time for is client work and working with survivors. So now is also a great time to think about the ways that you want to change or increase or add to the services that you have right now for sexual assault survivors. And there's just a lot of really good information about how to do that, how to start that, what that looks like on our website. So make sure to check that out. Maria or Liz, have I missed questions? I've been scrolling here on the chat box, just trying to see what I've missed. And is there anything that you've missed? I want to make sure I do it.
This was kind of brought up in the chat, and I think it's a really interesting question. Do you have any ideas or strategies that we could use when we're talking with community partners, especially thinking about law enforcement, about what we can still provide and what our limitations are? I know that, in a lot of our rural communities, those relationships are often there already, but if we're not, if we don't have access to, or we don't have like messaging around what's going on right now with our law enforcement, do you have any thoughts about that?
I just want to make sure I understand the question. Could you say more? Is it about like survivors that you're working with that have recently been assaulted that are seeking services at the hospital that now you're engaging with law enforcement, or just like in general what our relationship with law enforcement and as a community resource looks like? Or
Yeah, a little bit of both. I was thinking specifically that survivors who might be currently interacting with law enforcement due to something happening recently, and then law enforcement has certain expectations of our programs that have changed due to COVID-19, and how we're talking to them about what those changes look like, what we can still do, what we can't do, and how we can kind of partner with them in order to get the survivor the best services possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that conversation looks different depending, of course, on like what state or what your community is going through, and if your advocacy services have been deemed essential workers or not. Of course, I think that ends up looking different. But I mean, I think having honest, open, transparent conversations with law enforcement about what the realities and what that looks like are, if at all possible, writing it up, having that written down, not just communicated verbally. If you have a conversation with law enforcement, the chief of police, whoever that is in your community, to make sure you send a follow-up email that says sort of, here is what we talked about in that meeting, put it in writing so that they can keep referring to that. Consider handing out, if you've like radically changed how the process in which you incorporate law enforcement and you want everyone to be sort of updated about that, drop off a stack of papers for each police officer or sheriff or whoever the law enforcement is in your community, so that they know what that process looks like differently. But in general, I think we're changing just as much as law enforcement is having to change their own approach. And so I'd like to see that collaboration look warm and kind and understanding that our services are going to have to change and look a little different, just like the way they're providing the service that they provide to the community looks different. And, once again, my sort of overarching thing always is that, I just want to make sure we're not forgetting the survivors in our community that have had no interaction with law enforcement, don't have a desire to interact with law enforcement, or an ability to interact with law enforcement. All the adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse and the survivors of sexual abuse that, it's been years since the abuse has happened and are accessing our services for emotional support and medical services and peer counseling and exploration. Like that's where I think our priority needs to be, even more than making sure we're maintaining our relationship with law enforcement, because that's really only, you know, assisting, you know, 10% of the survivors that exist in our community if we're putting our efforts towards building our relationship with law enforcement. I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but.
Yes, thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left together. What other questions do folks have, or things you're struggling with or trying to figure out, or what's going really well for you? What are you excited about that's working? What do you want to brag about to everybody else on the webinar today? What's going well that you want to share with others so that others can adopt that also? Somebody said this email text thing has me worried, as we have folks at home with an abuser and they can't call or come in. So we've been promoting email instead of calling. Look, that's great. I'm not saying don't email folks. If that is what has been like working for the people in your community and need, that's okay. All I'm saying is that when you initiate or begin that emailing conversation with that person, that you just make sure they understand that it's not 100% confidential, that there corporation somewhere that has access to those emails, that information exists in the cloud, lives in the world. I would say that most of the time when advocates tell me they have that conversation, that the answer is that the survivor doesn't mind, that they have, we've all agreed to a lack of privacy to access lots of resources, social media, websites for our whole lives. And so for a lot of people that is normal. And if it's what's meeting their need, it's okay. If that's how you're able to stay in contact with them, if that's how they're able to meet their mental health needs and feel support and not feel isolated, keep doing it. I'm just saying that you want to be as transparent as possible about what that looks like for them. And yeah, Maria put a great resource into the chat box for you to use. Kathy asked, does anyone have a sample protocol that can be shared on remote advocacy? And honestly, my question to you, Kathy, is what do you mean by that? What is the policy or protocol that you want to in place around remote advocacy? Because I think remote advocacy is just like a really big umbrella term that just means providing advocacy not from the office. And I think so many advocates and so many organizations already have that as a regular occurrence, or already have that as a way that survivors can access services away from the home office. So are you asking for like a protocol on what it looks like to provide advocacy from somebody's home? Okay, so on confidentiality, communication, response. Yeah, and I think some of that can be written into a protocol, and some of that is just, you know, conversations you have with each individual staff member about what that's going to look like for them, since, you know, the confidentiality concerns are going to look a little bit different for every person based on sort of what their home experience ends up looking like. But yeah, I mean, if folks have samples of ones they want to add in the chat box, that's great. But I think often it's really important to create those protocols specific to your own agency and community, especially since, kind of everywhere is dealing with a version of this. And then have those really specific one-on-one conversations with the folks that, if you're advisor that you're supervising, or that supervisor should have with each person in the agency.
All right, do we have any final questions or thoughts? All right, not seeing anything in the chat box. I just want to thank you so much, Leah, for all of this incredible information and support. We really appreciate you taking the time to share all of your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Everyone that joined, you're a fantastic audience, and you added so many fantastic ideas in the chat box. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being in community with me this afternoon. And I hope everybody stays safe. Don't hesitate to reach out if any questions at all. It's my whole job is to help you guys. So feel free to email me, or every Tuesday and Thursday, I have 2-hour office hours. We send an email at 7 a.m. in the morning every Tuesday and Thursday with the times that day of what office hours are going to be. Tomorrow, it's going to be 2 to 4 Central Time. Feel free to email me, and I'll put you on the list to receive the email so you can join our office hours and be in community with others. And don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Maria and I will be in contact, follow up with you afterwards with the recording and all of the resources, so you have that available. And we hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.